Prologue. The bride who arrived was not the bride who was sent. This fact would take the court 3 days to discover, the chief advisor 4 days to confirm, and the king approximately 11 seconds. 11 seconds between the moment the carriage door opened and the moment Alpha King Eirik Solheim looked at the woman descending the steps and understood. Not suspected, not intuited. Understood with the full body, bone-level certainty that wolves produce when their instincts override their intellect. That the woman walking toward him was not Lady Annalise Duval, the 24-year-old daughter of the southern province's most powerful family, selected through 6 months of political negotiation to be his second wife. The woman walking toward him was someone else entirely, and the someone else was the only person who had caused a reaction in his nervous system in 3 years. The grief had been that long, 3 years since Queen Lena died, a winter illness that progressed from a cough to pneumonia, to the specific, accelerating organ failure that the physicians could slow but not stop, and that took his wife in 11 days while the king sat beside her bed holding her hand and learning. In real time, that power cannot keep a person alive when the body decides otherwise. 11 days, the same number as the seconds it would take him to recognize the wrong bride. The symmetry was not poetic. It was the particular ruthless mathematics of a universe that measures grief in units it later repurposes for other purposes. 3 years of silence. Not selective silence, comprehensive. The king governed, attended, functioned, but the man inside the governance had gone quiet the way a house goes quiet after a death. Not empty, but operating at a reduced frequency. The particular hum of a life that continues mechanically while the person living it observes from a growing distance. He did not smile. The court documented this not because the documentation was requested, but because the absence of a king's smile is a political fact that the court historian is obligated to record. Last documented smile, the morning before Queen Lena's diagnosis. 3 years, 1,095 days, 0 smiles. The marriage to Lady Annalise was the council's solution. Lord Aldrich Strand, the chief advisor, had argued for 18 months that the territory needed succession stability, that the diplomatic community needed a queen to engage with, and that the king himself needed, Strand's word, reactivation. The word was clinical, and Strand meant it clinically. The king was in a state of emotional dormancy that governance could sustain, but that human functioning could not survive indefinitely. The marriage was a stimulus, a controlled introduction of a variable that might, the council hoped, with the particular, inappropriate optimism of people who believe problems can be solved through administration, reactivate the man inside the king. Lady Annalise was selected for her family's political value, her social training, and her documented temperament, composed, reserved, unlikely to create disturbance. The council wanted a wife who would integrate smoothly into the silent court, and who would not challenge the particular fragile equilibrium that the king's grief had imposed on every person in the palace. They wanted calm. They wanted manageable. They wanted someone who would not disrupt. They did not get Lady Annalise. Lady Annalise had fled her family's estate 3 days before the departure, leaving a letter that said, with remarkable concision, "I will not marry a man who has not smiled in 3 years. I am 24. I deserve joy. Please send someone else and do not follow me." The Duval family, confronted with a diplomatic catastrophe, the king's bride vanishing 72 hours before the wedding, made the specific, desperate, unconscionable decision that powerful families make when reputation is threatened. They sent a substitute. Annalise's older cousin, the family's inconvenient relation, an herbalist who lived on the rural Duval estate, who had not been to court in a decade, who was not trained in etiquette or social performance, and who was not aware, when she was summoned to the main house and told she was traveling to the capital for a family obligation, that the obligation was a royal wedding and that the bride was her. Her name was Noah Kessler. She was 30. She was not composed, not reserved, not unlikely to create disturbance. She was honest. And honesty, in a court calibrated to silence, was the most disruptive force imaginable. The intended bride fled. The family sent a substitute who did not know she was a bride. The grieving king had not smiled in 3 years. He looked at the wrong woman stepping from the carriage, and knew, in 11 seconds, that the wrong woman was the only right thing that had entered his world since the grief began. Chapter 1. I did not know I was the bride until the carriage stopped. This is the fact I need stated at the outset, because the narrative that followed, the court, the king, the 3 years of silence that my arrival apparently disrupted, was built on a foundation of deception so specific that its architecture would have been admirable if it were not being used to traffic a woman into a marriage she had not agreed to. My aunt, Lady Margot Duval, had told me I was attending a diplomatic reception. A family obligation. Wear something appropriate. Bring your manners. Smile at the important people. Represent the Duval name for 3 days. Return home to the estate where your herbs and your quiet life and your absolute disinterest in court politics will be waiting. I believed her because I had no reason not to, and because the alternative, that my aunt was shipping me to the capital as a replacement bride for a king I had never met, was so beyond the boundaries of reasonable human behavior that suspecting it would have required a level of paranoia that my particular temperament did not support. The carriage stopped at the Solheim Palace. The door opened, and the receiving line, 40 people in formal dress, a ceremonial guard, flower arrangements that suggested something significantly more elaborate than a diplomatic reception, communicated, through the visual language of excessive preparation, that I had been lied to. I stepped from the carriage wearing the dress my aunt had selected, too formal for a reception, I realized now, specifically formal in the way that bridal garments are formal. I looked at the receiving line, at the ceremonial guard, at the flower arrangements. Then I looked at the man standing at the front of the reception, tall, dark-haired, with the particular hollowed stillness of someone whose interior had been vacated, and whose exterior was performing presence through muscle memory rather than intention. Alpha King Eirik Solheim looked at me, and the 11 seconds that the court would later describe as the moment of recognition, and that I would describe as the moment my life forked into before and after, was not the diplomatic assessment of a king receiving his bride. It was a flinch. The specific, involuntary, full-body flinch of a man whose dormant nervous system had just received an input so unexpected that the dormancy failed. His eyes widened. His posture shifted, the mechanical stillness breaking into something organic, something alive. The particular physical response of a body returning to active status after 3 years of operating in conservation mode. He looked at me, and something happened to his face that the court historian, standing 6 feet away with a notebook, recorded in real time: muscular engagement of the left orbicularis oculi and bilateral zygomaticus major. Not a smile. The precursor to a smile, the physiological preparation for an expression that his face had not produced in 1,095 days. Triggered by the sight of a woman who was not the woman he was expecting, and who was standing in the receiving line with the specific expression of a person who has just realized she has been trafficked into a marriage, and who is too stunned to perform anything except the raw, unfiltered, absolutely honest face of a woman processing betrayal in real time. That face, my face, the face of unperformed shock, was what did it. Not beauty, not grace, not the composed, reserved, unlikely to create disturbance quality that the council had selected for. The opposite. The completely uncontrolled, zero-performance, maximally honest expression of a human being who had just discovered that her family had sold her, and who was showing every molecule of that discovery on her face, because she did not know how to hide it, and would not have chosen to if she could. The king's precursor to a smile was directed at the most honest face he had seen in 3 years. Because honest faces had been absent from his court since the grief began, replaced by the careful, calibrated, grief-appropriate performances that every person around him produced to match his emotional weather. For 3 years, every face he saw was managed, controlled, adjusted to accommodate his silence, and the face stepping from the carriage, shocked, betrayed, furious, confused, alive with the particular, chaotic, unmanageable energy of a person experiencing real emotions in real time, was the first face in 3 years that was not performing. He saw it in 11 seconds. The wrong bride, the right face. And his body, which had been in conservation mode since Lena died, began, without permission, without the careful, controlled, council-approved process that the reactivation was supposed to follow, to wake up. She did not know she was the bride. Her face showed it: shock, betrayal, fury, all unperformed, and the king, who had been surrounded by managed faces for 3 years, saw the first honest expression since the grief began. His body woke up in 11 seconds, without permission. Because honesty, in a court of performance, is the most powerful stimulus there is. Chapter 2. I did not marry him that day. I did not marry him, because the first thing I did upon fully processing the situation was walk past the receiving line, past the ceremonial guard, past the 40 people in formal dress, and directly to the chief advisor, whose position I identified through the particular, panicked expression of the person most responsible for the administrative framework that had just received a human being, instead of the human being it had ordered. "You," I said to Lord Strand. "Are you the person who arranged this?" Lord Strand looked at me with the expression of a man whose carefully organized event was deviating from its script in a direction he could not control. "You are not Lady Annalise," he said. "I am not Lady Annalise," I confirmed. "I am Noah Kessler. I am Annalise's cousin. I was told I was attending a reception. I was not told I was attending my own wedding. The Duval family has sent me as a substitute for a bride who apparently fled, and I would like to speak to someone with the authority to explain why I should not flee as well." The receiving line heard this. All 40 people. The ceremonial guard heard it. The flower arrangements, being flowers, did not hear it but were implicated by proximity. And the king heard it, standing at the front of the reception, 6 feet from the woman who was supposed to be his bride, and who was instead delivering a direct, unfiltered, publicly audible assessment of the situation's ethical failures to his chief advisor. The words she used, trafficked, substitute, fled, were not diplomatic. They were accurate. And accuracy, in a court that had been speaking in careful euphemisms for 3 years, landed with the acoustic impact of a window being opened in a sealed room. Strand attempted to manage the situation. "Miss Kessler, perhaps we could discuss this privately." "We could not," I said, "because the discussion involves a marriage I did not consent to, performed in front of witnesses who should know that the bride standing here was lied to by her own family and delivered to a palace under false pretenses. I do not consent to this marriage. I do not consent to being a substitute, and I would like transportation home immediately." I looked at the king, the first time I directly addressed him, the first time our eyes met with the full weight of mutual attention. "I am sorry," I said to him. "You were expecting someone else, someone who agreed to this. I did not agree. I was not asked. And marrying a king I have never met because my family decided I was an acceptable replacement for the cousin who had the good sense to run is not something I am willing to do regardless of the political implications. You deserve a bride who chose to be here. I am not that bride." His eyes, which had been producing the precursor to a smile since I arrived, were now doing something more complex. The particular, focused, fully engaged attention of a man who was hearing words that were landing inside him in places that 3 years of managed speech had not reached. He did not respond immediately. Strand moved to speak. The king raised one hand, a small gesture, but the first volitional, non-mechanical gesture the court had witnessed in months, and Strand stopped. The king spoke. His voice was rough, not with emotion, with disuse. The particular vocal quality of a man who spoke during council meetings and governance sessions, but who had not spoken from the personal register in 3 years, because personal speech required personal presence, and personal presence had been dormant since Lena. "She is right," he said. The words were directed at Strand, but produced for the room. "She did not consent. The marriage cannot proceed without consent. Arrange transportation for Miss Kessler." He paused. "And investigate the Duval family's decision to send a substitute. Sending a woman to a marriage she does not know about is not a diplomatic arrangement. It is something else." The something else was left unnamed because the king did not need to name it. The room understood, and the room, 40 people who had been living in silence for 3 years, who had been performing managed emotion and calibrated speech, and the particular, careful, grief-compatible behavior that the king's weather demanded, heard a man speak from the personal register for the first time in 1,095 days. Because a woman who had been lied to had walked past their managed faces and spoken the truth without filtering it for royal consumption. And the truth, unfiltered, had reached the place inside the king that the filtering had been preventing every other voice from accessing. She walked past the receiving line and told the advisor, "I did not consent. Not diplomatic, accurate." The king heard it, raised one hand, first volitional gesture in months, said, "She is right. The marriage cannot proceed. Arrange transportation." His voice was rough with 3 years of disuse. The personal register, activated for the first time. By honesty. Chapter 3. I did not leave. Not because I was prevented. The transportation was arranged. The carriage was prepared. The return to the Duval estate was logistically available within hours of my public refusal. I did not leave because of what happened after the receiving line. After the refusal. After the king spoke in his personal register and the court heard a voice they had not heard in 3 years, he asked me to stay. Not for the marriage was dissolved the moment I refused consent and the dissolution was permanent. He asked me to stay for tea. 1 cup, he said. In the garden. Not as a bride, as a person. Because you are the first person who has spoken to me honestly in 3 years, and I would like. His voice cracked on the like, the word itself an admission that wanting was something he had not practiced since the wanting stopped being possible. I would like to hear more of what honesty sounds like. The request was made privately. In the corridor, after the receiving line dispersed, with Strand hovering at a diplomatic distance and Commander Petra, Lindvist standing guard with the particular expression of a security professional who was witnessing something unprecedented and who was adjusting her operational posture from ceremony management to something she could not yet classify. 1 cup of tea in the garden became 4 hours, not because we were falling in love, because we were talking. The specific, rare, undiluted talking that happens when 2 people who have been performing for different audiences suddenly find themselves in a conversation where neither is performing. He was not performing grief. I was not performing bridal compliance. We were 2 people in a garden who had both, through different mechanisms, been placed in positions they did not choose, and who were discovering, through the particular relief of mutual honesty, that the not choosing was something they shared. He told me about Lena, not immediately, 90 minutes in, after the tea had been refilled twice and the conversation had moved from the political logistics of my accidental arrival to the personal territory that the political logistics had, unexpectedly, unlocked. She was the best person I knew, he said. Not performatively, simply. The statement of a man describing a fact. She died and I could not. He stopped. Could not stop it, I finished. He nodded. The nod was small and it cost him. I am a healer, I said. An herbalist. I work with the specific, limited tools that plant medicine provides, which are significant but not omnipotent. I have lost patience. Not a wife, patience, but the losing feels the same regardless of the relationship. The specific, personal failure of a person whose skill is sustaining life, confronting the reality that life does not always agree to be sustained. He looked at me. The looking was the 11-second quality again. The full, unguarded, dormancy, breaking attention of a man whose nervous system was treating my presence as a stimulus it could not ignore. You are an herbalist, he said. I have a greenhouse, I said. On the Duval estate. 87 medicinal species. I spend most of my time there. Growing things. Compounding remedies, treating the estate's workers when they need medical attention, which is frequently because the estate's official physician is 73 years old and considers most ailments to be character weaknesses rather than medical conditions. He almost smiled. The precursor to a smile from the receiving line returned, the bilateral muscular engagement that the court historian had documented, now occurring in a garden during a conversation about a 73-year-old physician with questionable diagnostic philosophy. The almost smile was closer to a smile than the receiving line version. Closer because the conversation was closer. Because the distance between 2 people who are not performing is shorter than the distance between a king and a substitute bride, and the shorter distance allowed the smile's precursor to advance further toward completion. Your greenhouse, he said. Tell me about the greenhouse. So I did. I told him about the 87 species, their properties, their applications, the particular intimate relationship between a healer and her plants that develops over years of daily contact. I told him about the compounding, the specific, precise, almost musical process of combining plant materials into medicines that the academic establishment did not formally recognize, but that the estate's workers trusted, because the medicines worked, and because working was the only credential that mattered to people who needed healing. I told him about the greenhouse's architecture, how I had designed the layout based on the plant's light requirements, creating a spatial logic that organized the space around the needs of its inhabitants rather than the convenience of its operator. The telling was not calculated. I was not performing expertise to impress a king. I was describing the thing I loved to a person who was listening. And the listening, the particular, focused, fully present quality of a man whose attention had been dormant, and was now, in a garden over cold tea, fully active, made the describing feel like the most important thing I had done since arriving at a palace I was not supposed to be in. 4 hours. 1 cup of tea extended into an afternoon that neither of us wanted to end. The conversation moved from the greenhouse to the grief, from the grief to the silence, from the silence to the particular, shared recognition that both of us had been living in environments that did not require our authentic presence. His because grief had made authenticity unbearable. Mine because the Duval estate had never valued the authentic version of me over the useful version. We were both, in different ways, people whose real selves had been filed away while the functional versions operated the machinery of daily life. His filing was grief. Mine was family. The mechanism was different. The vacancy was the same. 4 hours over cold tea. She told him about 87 medicinal species and a greenhouse designed around the plant's needs. He told her about Lena. Neither was performing. And the distance between two honest people, shorter than any royal protocol, allowed the precursor to a smile to advance closer to completion than anything in 3 years. Chapter 4. I stayed for a week. Then the carriage that had been arranged for my departure was quietly returned to the transport pool because neither the king nor I had mentioned it, and the staff, who had been navigating the silent court's atmospheric conditions with professional sensitivity for 3 years, recognized that the atmospheric conditions were changing and that the change was connected to the herbalist who was spending every afternoon in the palace garden talking to the king about plant medicine and grief and the particular intersection of healing and loss that both subjects occupied. The palace had a greenhouse. Unused, a glass structure on the western grounds that had been Queen Lena's project before her death and that no one had entered since. Eirik showed it to me on day 9, not because he was ready to enter it, but because he was ready to have me enter it, which was a different kind of readiness and a different kind of courage. The greenhouse was overgrown. 3 years of neglect had produced a botanical chaos that most people would have found overwhelming and that I found beautiful. The particular, aggressive, undiscriminating vitality of plants that had been left to their own devices and that had responded to the absence of human management by becoming more themselves rather than less. The herbs Lena had planted were still alive, thriving, actually, freed from the careful pruning that gardens impose. The plants had expanded into the shapes their genetics preferred rather than the shapes a gardener's aesthetic demanded. I can work with this, I said. Eirik was standing at the greenhouse door, not entering. The way he stood at the threshold of many things that connected to Lena, present but not crossing. The standing at doors was the physical expression of his grief's boundary. He could approach the places that held her memory but could not enter them, because entering meant accepting that the places continued without her, and that the continuing was not a betrayal but a fact. You would restore it? He asked. Not restore, I said. Continue. The plants Lena started are alive. They have been growing for 3 years without direction. I would not prune them back to what they were. I would work with what they have become. The growing did not stop when she died. It changed direction. The new direction is not wrong. It is just different. He looked at the greenhouse, at the overgrown herbs, at the woman standing inside the green chaos that his dead wife had planted, and that he had sealed away because sealing was the only grief management his particular constitution could produce. Different, he repeated. Not wrong. Just different. Yes. I paused. The greenhouse is not the only thing that kept growing after she died, Eirik. He closed his eyes. The closing was not rejection. It was processing. The specific internal work of a man hearing a truth that his body recognized before his mind was ready to confirm it. Then he opened his eyes, stepped over the threshold, entered the greenhouse for the first time in 3 years, and stood among the plants his wife had planted and the growth that had continued without her and the woman who was standing in the middle of it all. And the standing, in the green, in the chaos, in the continuing, did not feel like betrayal. It felt like the greenhouse. Different. Not wrong, growing in a new direction. He smiled. Not the precursor, not the bilateral muscular preparation. An actual, complete, visible, full-faced smile produced by a man who had not smiled in 1,095 days, and whose face remembered the configuration the way a muscle remembers a movement it has not performed, but has not forgotten. The smile was small, uncertain, the expression of a face testing whether the action was still possible and discovering that it was. Mrs. Dagny, the head housekeeper, was passing the greenhouse at that moment, not coincidentally, because Mrs. Dagny's routes through the palace grounds were as strategically engineered as military patrols. She saw the smile through the glass walls. She stopped walking. She stood on the garden path and watched her king smile for the first time in 3 years inside a greenhouse full of his dead wife's plants and a living woman's honesty. And Mrs. Dagny, who had maintained the silent court for 3 years with the particular, devoted, heartbroken efficiency of a woman who remembered what the palace sounded like before the grief, pressed her hand against her chest and said, "To no one, to the garden, to the air that was suddenly warmer. There he is. He stood at the greenhouse door. She said. The growing did not stop when she died. It changed direction. The new direction is not wrong. He stepped inside for the first time in 3 years, stood among his wife's plants and the new growth, and smiled. The first real smile in 1,095 days. Mrs. Dagny saw it through the glass and pressed her hand to her chest. There he is. Chapter 5. The knowing was what he called it afterward, the 11 seconds at the carriage, the moment his dormant nervous system fired for the first time in 3 years in response to a woman who was not the woman he expected. He knew. Not that I was his future wife. Not that the relationship would develop the way it did. The knowing was more fundamental than romantic prediction. He knew that I was real, that the face stepping from the carriage was the first unmanaged face he had seen since Lena's death, that the honesty radiating from a woman who had just discovered she had been trafficked into a marriage was the specific, raw, unperformable authenticity that his grief-sealed system was calibrated to respond to. Because grief, whatever else it destroys, does not destroy the ability to recognize truth. It sharpens it. 3 years of managed faces had made him an expert in detecting management. My face was unmanaged, and the unmanagement, the shock, the fury, the refusal to perform compliance was the signal his dormant system had been waiting for. Not beauty, not grace. Truth. He told me this in the greenhouse, 3 weeks after my accidental arrival, during an afternoon session where I was repotting Lena's lavender which had grown magnificently wild and which needed structural support rather than cutting back, and he was sitting on the bench that had been Lena's, and that was now his, and that would eventually be ours because the possessive pronouns of grief are not replaced but expanded. I knew in 11 seconds, he said. I looked up from the lavender. The words were delivered with the particular, direct simplicity that had become our conversational mode. No diplomatic padding, no careful filtering. The specific, clean communication of two people who had discovered that honesty between them was not just preferable but structurally necessary. Knew what? I asked. That you were not Annalise, obviously. But more than that. I knew that you were, he searched. The searching was not for a word. It was for the courage to use the word he had already found. Necessary. He said the word with the specific, careful weight of a man placing something fragile on a surface and watching to see if the surface would hold. You were necessary. From the first second. Before you spoke. Before you refused the marriage. Before the garden or the greenhouse or any of the things that came after. In the 11 seconds between the carriage door opening and your feet hitting the ground, my body produced a response that it had not produced in 3 years. Interest. Want. The specific, alive, reaching toward quality that grief had shut down, and that your face, your unperformed, unmanaged, completely honest face, reactivated. I did not choose the reactivation. My system chose it. The way your heart chooses to beat, the way lungs choose to breathe. The reactivation was involuntary, which is how I knew it was real. Because real things do not ask permission. They happen. I set down the lavender, looked at this man, the grieving king, whose silence I had accidentally shattered by being too honest to perform and too furious to pretend. The man who had entered his dead wife's greenhouse because I was standing in it, and my standing there had made the entering possible. The man whose smile I had witnessed through glass walls while Mrs. Dagny wept on the garden path. I was not supposed to be here, I said. I know, he said. And yet the accidental version, the wrong bride, the unintended, the substitute who refused to substitute, is the version that worked. The council spent 6 months selecting the right bride. The right bride fled, and the wrong one walked past my receiving line and told my advisor she did not consent and spoke the first honest words my court had heard in 3 years. He paused. Lena would have liked you. The sentence landed with the particular, sacred weight of a widower introducing his dead wife to the person who was helping him live again. The introduction was not a comparison. It was a benediction. She would have liked the honesty, he continued. She was honest. Brutally. It was the quality I loved most in her, and the quality this court lost when she died, because her honesty gave everyone else permission to be honest, and without her the permission was revoked and the management began. I brought my hands to his face, soil on my fingers from the lavender repotting, Lena's lavender, wild and structural, growing in a new direction that was not wrong. The soil transferred to his jaw. He did not wipe it away. "You have dirt on your face," I said. "From your wife's lavender." He smiled. The second smile, bigger than the first, produced not by the absence of grief but by the presence of something alongside it. The specific, expanding, tentatively reaching quality of a man who was discovering that the grief and the living could share the same greenhouse, and the same bench, and the same face, with soil on it from a dead woman's plants tended by a living woman's hands. "I know," he said. "Leave it." 11 seconds. Not beauty, not grace. Truth. His dormant system reactivated involuntarily because her unmanaged face was the first real thing in 3 years. He said, "Real things do not ask permission. They happen." She put soil on his face from his wife's lavender. He said, "Leave it." The second smile, bigger than the first. Epilogue. 2 years later. Their daughter was born in the greenhouse because Noah refused to give birth anywhere that did not contain growing things. And the greenhouse, Lena's greenhouse, Noah's greenhouse. The shared greenhouse where the dead wife's plants and the living wife's remedies grew side by side in the particular expansive cohabitation that grief and love produce when neither is asked to replace the other, was the only room in the palace that contained enough life to welcome more of it. They named her Lena, not as a replacement, as a continuation. The name carried forward the way the lavender carried forward, not pruned back to its original shape, but growing in a new direction that honored the roots while reaching for different light. Eirik smiled daily now. Not the constant, performative cheerfulness that courts expected from recovered kings. The specific, honest, earned smiles of a man whose grief had not ended, but whose living had resumed alongside it. The smiles were produced by specific stimuli, his daughter's particular, focused expression when examining plants, which was identical to her mother's particular, focused expression when compounding remedies. The sound of Noah arguing with the palace physician, a man named Dr. Aldrich Voss, who was 68 and who considered herbal medicine to be folklore, and who engaged in weekly debates with the queen that the staff attended as entertainment. The greenhouse itself, which had been sealed for 3 years and which was now the most alive space in the palace. 87 original species plus the 43 that Noah had added, creating a collection that the Botanical Academy described as the most comprehensive medicinal garden in the territory, and that Noah described as a work in progress because gardens, like grief, are never finished. They are only ever continuing. The Duval family was investigated. Lady Margot's decision to send an unconsenting substitute to a royal wedding was classified as fraud, not treason, because the intent was familial preservation rather than political harm, but fraud. Because sending a woman to a marriage she did not know about by telling her she was attending a reception was fraudulent regardless of the sender's motivation. The investigation produced consequences, financial penalties, diplomatic restrictions, and the particular social diminishment that the aristocracy applies to families who are caught doing what many families do but few are stupid enough to do to a king. Lady Annalise, the bride who fled, was located in a coastal town where she was living under an assumed name and working as a music teacher. She was not returned. She was not punished. The king's official position, communicated through Lord Strand, was, Lady Annalise exercised her right to refuse a marriage she did not want. Her refusal produced the circumstances that brought Noah Kessler to this palace. The crown does not punish the person whose good judgment produced the crown's best outcome. One evening, Noah sat in the greenhouse with baby Lena on her lap, surrounded by the plants that 2 women had grown in the same soil, one who planted them and one who continued them. Eirik entered, not through the doorway threshold that he had once been unable to cross. Through the door, fully, the way a person enters a room they inhabit rather than a room they are visiting. He sat on the bench. Their bench, the bench that had been Lena's and then his and then theirs, and that now held the particular accumulated weight of every conversation, every smile, every honest word that had been spoken on its surface, since an accidental bride walked past a receiving line and refused to pretend. "You know what I think about," he said. "Tell me." The 11 seconds. The carriage. Your face. He looked at baby Lena, who was asleep against her mother's chest with the particular boneless surrender of an infant who had never known a world without growing things and warm greenhouses and a father who smiled. "I had not smiled in 3 years," he said, "and in 11 seconds, my face remembered how. Not because you were performing something designed to produce a smile. Because you were not performing anything. You were furious and betrayed and honest about both, and the honesty was the most beautiful thing I had seen since Lena died. because the honesty was alive in a world I had stopped believing contained living things. She looked at him, at the man whose silence she had broken by accident, by honesty, by the particular uncontrollable realness of a woman discovering she had been trafficked and reacting with the full, unmanaged, maximally alive fury that the discovery demanded. The council wanted composed, she said. They wanted reserved. They wanted unlikely to create disturbance. They got me. He leaned across the bench, kissed her forehead with the particular gentleness that the greenhouse had taught him. The gentleness of a man who had learned, through plants and grief and a woman whose face could not perform, that the strongest things grow in the direction nobody planned. They got you, he confirmed. The unintentional bride. The wrong woman. The person who walked into this palace by accident and broke 3 years of silence by being too honest to be silent. He looked at the greenhouse. At the plants growing in 2 directions, Lena's original planting and Noah's continuation, intertwined now indistinguishable, the roots shared even where the growth diverged. The wrong woman, he said. Who was right from the first second, who broke the silence not by trying to break it, but by refusing to participate in it. Who brought honesty into a palace that had forgotten what it sounded like. The unintentional bride. The only one who could have worked. Because intention would have produced performance, and what I needed, what the grief needed, what the silence needed, was not performance. It was the specific, unrehearsed, absolutely real sound of a woman saying, I did not consent to this, and meaning every word. Baby Lena stirred. The greenhouse hummed with the particular quiet vitality of 130 plants growing in shared soil, and the king who had not smiled in 3 years held the hand of the woman who had broken his silence by accident, and who had stayed by choice, and who had taught him. Through honesty and lavender and the particular courage of walking past a receiving line and speaking the truth. That the strongest healing does not come from the medicine you compound, or the grief you process, or the careful, managed, council-approved reactivation plan. It comes from the real thing, the unintended, the honest, the face that cannot perform, the voice that refuses to be silent, the accidental bride who was never supposed to be there, and who was, from the first 11 seconds, the only person who was supposed to be there at all.